Well, welcome back, everybody, to part two of Alive and Well. This slide looks familiar. It was kind of the ending point of the first segment, and I want to pick up here and really drive to the crux of establishing the relationship, the very, very important relationship between diabetes and obesity, the twin epidemics, and this host of other common illnesses and diseases that Americans suffer from. All right, so we'll get into that and establishing the relationship between diabetes and obesity and all of these other illnesses and diseases. Now, I wanted to just share with you, I've mentioned a couple of times the importance of blood flow to all of the organs and tissues and organ systems of the body. And as I talk about the common thread that knits together, that sort of is the connection between diabetes and obesity and this host of other illnesses and diseases, this is a great way to kind of make that connection in a practical way, and that is the progression of vascular disease. And so what you see here is a series of blood vessels that have been cross-sectioned so that you can kind of look down, as it were, down a tube. This would be an early stage right here of the disease process we would call atherosclerosis. A common disease process, takes decades to become symptomatic. And progressively, as you can see in this series of photographs here, the inner part of the blood vessel through which the blood flows, called the lumen, becomes progressively more and more narrowed, okay, to the point that it becomes completely occluded. And obviously, the problem with diseases of the blood vessels, and as I've kind of alluded to, endothelial inflammation, in other words, inflammation of this one cell thick lining of the blood vessels. Part of the problem is, well, I guess the crux of the problem is that once a blood vessel becomes occluded, blood flow downstream stops, and all of the cells and the tissues and organs and organ systems become deprived of blood, and they either become dysfunctional or they can die. So we have such thing as a heart attack, an acute myocardial infarction, in which heart muscle tissue actually dies as a result of this process. And most of these illnesses and diseases that you see on this list share this common sort of, if you will, pathophysiology. In other words, what is it that goes wrong at the vascular level that ends up causing these various illnesses and diseases? So to step back then again and look kind of at the big picture before we go back in and focus specifically on the blood vessels themselves. As you're aware, we talked about the twin epidemics of obesity and diabetes. So just to kind of build the epidemiologic, if you will, or how big a problem obesity is. This is a slide showing the trends from 1985 through 2009, and you can see how progressively and alarmingly, over the course of this several decades, the proportion of the population of the various states has become obese, to the point that in 2009, the most recent year for which this data is available, there's a good portion of the middle part of the United States where over 25%, and in many cases over 30% of the population is obese. And the other thing that's not reflected on this slide, so that's about a third of the population which is obese. But the other thing is that about a third of the population is also overweight. Now, overweight is just this side of obese, but an obese is a higher BMI, and we'll get into defining this specifically later. But the combination of the two here is that 2/3 of the population is either overweight or obese, okay, which is a profoundly alarming proportion of the population at risk for all of these illnesses and diseases. Now, to carry this illustration one point further, the Centers for Disease Control publishes this report, Healthy People, about every 10 years. And in the Healthy People 2000 and 2010, in 2000, a set of targets was established, and in 2010, the progress of the nation toward these targets was measured. And I wanted to just share a few of them. They are very, very disappointing and alarming. But in terms of the obesity epidemic, you can see that this red color here indicates a move away from the target, and you can see in every one of these 5 areas related to obesity, we moved over a 10-year period, not toward, but away from a nationally established public health target having to do with overweight and obesity. And you can look at the specifics here. I'll just give you one example. The 2010 target that was established in 2000 was that 60% of the population be at a healthy weight. And the baseline year, which is identified here as 88 to 94, the baseline was 42% of the population was at a healthy weight, and in 2008, which formed the database for the 2010 report, only 31%. So we moved 11 percentage points away from the target, which was to get 60%. And as I just mentioned, in fact, today, 2/3 of the population is either overweight or obese, which is where this 60% number comes from. And the rest of these statistics are equally of concern. And the last 3 here have to do with pediatric and childhood obesity of different age groupings, which is, along with adult obesity, moving in the wrong direction. Now, this is a slide, very interestingly, that tracks obesity and diabetes over the decades, the incidence or frequency of them together on the same graph. And it's fascinating here that the two seem to move in direct relationship with each other. And so it raises the question, why? Why are diabetes and obesity connected to each other? What is the connection of the two twin epidemics, the two disease processes we know as diabetes and obesity? And now this shows, a particular relationship. It doesn't prove causality, but it sure raises the suspicion that there is an actual medical connection between the two. And so I want to continue to establish that connection right down to the very crux of what I've called vascular disease or endothelial inflammation. But again, to kind of pick up some other relevant statistics here, I'm sure you're familiar with diabetes and hypertension, but you may not have heard of prediabetes and prehypertension, okay, which, as the name implies, includes the same kinds of problems as occur in diabetes, but in the years prior to, or in the disease state prior to the actual diagnosis of diabetes or hypertension. And the the alarming thing about this is, number one, the incidence of it. So 35 to 50% of the population being pre-diabetic. I mean, that's alarming. 50% of 50-year-olds have pre-hypertension. And the really bad thing, and I'll get into this more in future segments, but the bad thing and the alarming thing about these pre-states is they carry many of the same risk factors of going on to develop heart attacks, strokes, and so on and so forth, as the actual diagnosed condition of diabetes or hypertension. And then the metabolic syndrome, which you may have heard of, is bumping up and along at a rate of about 25% of the population. And of course, it's a connection of five different illnesses here. This is kind of a syndrome, as the name implies. And three, you have to have at least three of these: obesity, hypertension, high blood glucose, low high-density lipoproteins, or high triglycerides. These are biometric measures in order to have the metabolic syndrome, which carries with it an increased risk of many different diseases that we looked at on that initial slide. Now, this is fascinating, I think. Dr. Thomas Sydenham was an English physician in the 1800s who made this statement, which the truth of which is becoming increasingly evident in the current day. A man is as old as his arteries. Now, as I've alluded to a number of times, the key connection, the common thread between the host of illnesses and diseases which are costing Americans their lives and their health and their fortunes, is this thing we're calling endothelial inflammation. Now, the endothelium, if we look at the blood vessel, there are three layers. Okay, there's the intima, okay, which is the innermost layer, which is lined by endothelial tissue, very smooth, thin, glistening, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. So that's the intima. We have the media, which is the middle smooth muscle layer, and then we have the adventitia, which is the thicker outer covering of the blood vessel. Well, endothelial inflammation is a state in which the intima, I-N-T-I-M-A, that very delicate innermost lining, okay, the intima, becomes inflamed. The intima is made of endothelium, the type of cell that forms it. And so a couple of other things here. Your vascular age, the state of your arteries, is more important than your chronological age and the evolution of cardiovascular disease. And many of these illnesses that we're talking about are cardiovascular diseases. And so this really gets to the crux issue. And this is very alarming, that obese children have been shown to have a vascular age about 30 years older than their actual age. And there are two different tests which are currently being used to kind of look at the state of the endothelium of blood vessels. One of them is calcium scoring using CT scanning technology, and calcium scoring looks at the calcification of these plaques or atheromas on the inner surface of the endothelium of blood vessels using, like I said, CT scanning. But carotid intimal medial thickness uses ultrasound technology, as pictured here, to look at the thickening of the intimal and medial layers of, in this case, the carotid arteries, which is thought to be and being researched as a possible indicator of endothelial inflammation, and along with it the risk of a host of all these vascular diseases. So now I'd like to talk about the very direct relationship between diabetes and obesity and this host of other illnesses which sort of share this disease process of vascular and endothelial inflammation. So there's a lot of ways to do this, some of which are very, very deep scientifically, but I think the way that I'm gonna help you understand this is a very simple pictorial kind of way of looking at how it is that the inner part of blood vessels become inflamed and diseased. So at the middle of this picture, we've got the sugar cube here, which represents diabetes, all right, which is a problem with blood sugar, and obesity, which has a number of aspects, but not the least of which is the amount of sugar and fat in the American diet. So what we're going to be looking at is this outer ring around here, beginning with the process that results from high blood sugar and fat and obesity leading to gradual occlusion. Now you recall the slide we looked at earlier. This is a cross section of the blood vessel, and it should be nice and round and open here so that blood flows through it. But in a state of inflammation of the blood vessel, gradually this disease process we called atherosclerosis progresses, in which the center part of the blood vessel becomes narrowed, all right? And narrowing results in a reduction of blood flow and eventually even occlusion or stoppage of blood flow, which leads to death downstream. Now, secondly, we get narrowing and occlusion. We get thrombosis. Now, thrombosis is the medical word for clotting, okay? Development of a blood clot. Now, in a normal, healthy blood vessel, there are many chemical processes at work to prevent formation of clots and prevent clumping of blood cells together. But in the state of inflammatory state of the endothelium resulting from high blood sugar and all of the things that happen as a result of diabetes and obesity, there is a propensity, an ability, an increased likelihood of clot formation. Then thirdly, we have oxidative stress. Now, this is represented here by the rusty gears, and really, in fact, it's a very good analogy, because the disease processes of diabetes and obesity, which result in endothelial inflammation, really do corrode and rust the cellular metabolic processes. And as with rusty gears, it slows down their functioning. You know, it makes them squeak, as it were, when they're trying to turn. They don't work effectively. I mean, you may have heard of oxygen-free radicals or oxidative stress happening in the cells and tissues of the body, and this really is the equivalent of cellular rust. And then next we have inflammation, okay? And so, you know, as the name endothelial inflammation would lead us to believe, and accurately so, these disease processes of diabetes and obesity lead to this chronic state of inflammation, which again prevents normal, healthy cellular and metabolic functioning, all right, and makes the likelihood of these other things, the oxidation, the clotting, the narrowing, all much greater. And then finally, constriction. Now, and constriction happens at multiple different levels when we live a stressed, exercise deprived, obese, or diabetic lifestyle. But at the vascular level, in a normal, healthy state, the blood vessels are relaxed, okay, and they're dilated, and blood flows through them easily and effortlessly and smoothly. But in an inflamed state, as is the case in diabetes and obesity, many of the chemical factors, such as nitric acid, for instance, which helps to keep the blood vessels relaxed and dilated, the development of the chemicals that keep that nice, relaxed blood vessel is inhibited, and so blood vessels become constricted. And of course, as we've already observed, in that situation, then blood flow becomes reduced, and good perfusion and oxygenation of cells and tissues is made more difficult. Now, just as I mentioned, I wanted to give you an actual example of what this looks like. This is the inner surface of a healthy artery, and notice how pink and smooth and glistening it is. And here's an example of the inner surface of an atherosclerotic artery, and notice how bumpy and inflamed and red it is. And that's really the difference. I mean, the difference between nice, smooth, relaxed arteries through which blood can flow effortlessly, quickly, in large enough quantities to keep the tissues well satisfied with nutrients and oxygen, versus a blood vessel here in which none of that can happen, hence the name endothelial inflammation. Now, I just wanted to end on, I will go into this in more depth in future segments, but just to kind of take us a step forward now, I mean, I have given you, you know, I think the direct connection between obesity and diabetes and this host of other common illnesses and diseases. But just to kind of take us one step forward with this question, is all fat created equal? And we're going to talk in a future segment about the differences between subcutaneous fat and visceral fat. Now, visceral fat is belly fat, okay? It's pot belly fat, if you will. And visceral fat is a very powerful endocrine organ. And I'll go into this a little bit later, but it has all of these very, very negative aspects, which subcutaneous fat, which is the fat that's kind of distributed throughout the entire body in a much more even fashion, it is very, very different metabolically than visceral fat, for a host of reasons, many of which have to do with clotting and inflammation. And we'll get into this in more detail, but I wanted to just kind of whet your appetite, as it would, for where it is we're going to head now that we understand the direct connection between diabetes and obesity and vascular disease. And so finally, just to end on kind of a humorous note, and sort of where we'll get into, you know, in future segments, well, the doc says it seems your weight is perfect, you just happen to be 11 feet too short. And so, you know, we find this all too often true, you know, as we go to visit the doctor to find out our health or lack thereof. And we'll go on from here, having laid kind of an introduction and a framework, you know, within which to understand the connections between diabetes and obesity. I now want to get into some of the specifics of how we can make decisions that lead to a healthier lifestyle.